The wind did not begin as wind. It began as silence. On the afternoon of February 9th, 1884, at 17 minutes past 3, the sky above the Dakota Plains turned the color of old pewter, and every bird that had been singing in the cottonwoods went still. A woman in a long black dress stood at the mouth of a limestone cave on a bluff 4 miles north of the town of Hollowfield. Her name was Sigrid Halverson. She was 37 years old, a widow of 2 years and 7 months, and in her left hand she held the bridle of a chestnut horse called Copper, and at her right hip pressed the warm flank of a gray Norwegian elk-hound named Björn. She did not look at the sky. She had already seen what the sky was about to do. She turned the horse into the dark of the cave, walking him past the threshold of cold stone, past the wooden cabin she had built with her own hands, and the hands of a younger woman who waited for her now inside, past the lantern light that swung gently from a hook above the door. She closed the heavy oak slab behind her and slid the iron bolt across with a sound that seemed in that moment louder than anything in the world. Then only then did she allow herself to whisper in the language she had spoken as a child in a fishing village on the coast of Norway, the only words that mattered. "Magnus," she said, "I have finished it." Outside, the wind found the bluff and screamed. You are about to hear the story of how this widow, mocked by an entire town, came to be the only person in Stark County who was ready for what came down out of Canada that February. You will hear about a husband who died too young, about a sister-in-law who turned her back on a wedding and walked away from a man who had insulted the people who made her about a Pawnee elder, who remembered a winter no living American remembered, and about a dog that heard what no human ear could hear. Stay with me. Let the story breathe. The places we are going have been waiting a long time for someone to walk into them. 7 months earlier, on a July afternoon, so hot the boards of the boardwalk in Hollowfield sweated pine sap, Sigrid Halverson pushed open the door of the county land office and removed her black bonnet. The office smelled of tobacco and warm paper. Mayor Bartholomew Pritchard sat behind a desk piled with maps and ledgers, fanning himself with a folded newspaper. He was a soft, careful man with a soft, careful mouth, and he had not expected to see a woman in widow's weeds standing in his doorway with dust on her boots. He rose half out of courtesy and half out of habit. "Mrs. Halverson," he said. He gestured at the chair across from his desk. "Please." She did not sit. She placed a leather folio on his desk and opened it. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a survey map of a parcel of land 3 miles long and 2 miles wide, drawn in a careful engineer's hand with notations in pencil in the margins. The second was a receipt for a deposit of $40 made against the future purchase of that parcel, dated September of 1880. The receipt was signed Magnus Halverson. Mayor Pritchard looked down at the papers. He looked up at the woman. He looked down at the papers again. "Your late husband," he said, carefully made a deposit on this land. He did. In 1880. He did. That was 3 years ago. It was. The mayor sat down slowly. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it to his forehead. "Mrs. Halverson," he said, "this parcel, this is the bluff, north of town, the one with the limestone outcropping and the forgive me opening in the rock. Yes, that land is not arable. You cannot plow it. You cannot graze a herd on it. The soil over the cap is no more than a few inches thick. It is forgive me worthless land. My husband did not think so. Your husband, may God rest him, was a railroad surveyor. He was not a farmer." "No," she said. He was not. He was a man who had read the land for 15 years and knew which parts of it would hold a man up in a hard year and which parts would let him fall through. The mayor was silent for a long moment. He looked at the receipt again as though he hoped the ink might rearrange itself into something he could refuse. "There is no provision in the Homestead Act," he said at last, "for a widow to file a loan." "There is no provision against it either," Sigrid said. "I have read the statute. I read it 3 times on the train from Minneapolis. Section 3 permits any head of household over 21 years of age. I am the head of my household. I am 37. The deposit was made in good faith. I have come to complete the purchase." The mayor opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. She did not raise her voice. She had not, in the 2 years since Magnus had been carried out of a railroad tunnel in a canvas tarp, raised her voice for anything. "Stamp the papers, Mr. Pritchard," she said. "Please." He stamped the papers. When she walked out of the land office that afternoon, the heat hit her like a hand against her face. She stood for a moment on the boardwalk and let it. Then she walked to where Copper was tied, and she rested her forehead against the warm hollow of his neck, and she closed her eyes, and she said nothing at all. She had a parcel of land. She had a husband's plan drawn out 3 years before he died in a tunnel in Montana, when a beam had failed and the mountain had come down. She had a sister-in-law on a train from Minneapolis due to arrive on the 18th. She had a dog. She had a horse. She had $93.40 in a tin box under her cot at the boarding house. She had Magnus's barometer, his survey case, his Pawnee tobacco pouch, his grandfather's Mora knife, and a journal full of drawings she had not been brave enough yet to study in full. She had a winter coming somewhere out beyond the curve of the earth. She had everything she needed. The first thing you need to understand before we go any further is this. Sigrid Halvorsen was not a grieving woman doing a foolish thing. She was a grieving woman completing the dream of the man she had loved exactly the way he had designed it. Magnus had walked that bluff in the summer of 1879 when the railroad survey had brought him through Stark County. He had stood at the mouth of the limestone cave and run his hand along the cool rock, and he had said to himself the way a man does when he is alone and the country is empty, that one day he would build his wife a house inside that stone. He had drawn the plans. He had banked the deposit. He had told no one, not even her, because he wanted it to be a surprise. The cave was the surprise. And then in May of 1881, in a tunnel near a town in Montana that nobody now remembers, the surprise became a will. And Sigrid Halvorsen, the woman he had not yet had time to tell, walked out of a land office in Hollowfield 2.5 years later holding the surprise in her hand like a candle. "Now, before we go any further, I want you to do something for me. I want you to think of a person you have loved who is not here anymore. A husband, a mother, a sister, a child, someone whose absence you have learned to carry the way Sigrid carried Magnus like a coat you cannot take off. If you have someone like that in your mind right now, type their name in the comments below. Just the name. We will carry them with us through this story together." The town of Hollowfield, in the summer of 1883, was 412 souls strong. A Lutheran church and a Methodist one, 2 saloons, a feed store, a milliner, a doctor who had been to medical school in St. Louis, and a doctor who had not a Norwegian baker, a German blacksmith, and an Irish midwife. It sat in a shallow bowl of grassland at the southern foot of a long bluff of pale limestone that rose up out of the prairie like the back of a sleeping animal. The bluff was called Whispering Bluff, because when the wind came down off the Canadian plains in winter, it found the limestone hollows and made a sound that if you were a child and your grandmother had told you the right stories, you might mistake for a voice. Sigrid arrived at her new land on the morning of July 22nd with a borrowed wagon, 2 axes, 3 weeks of flour and salt pork, a canvas tent, and her dog. She set the tent up in the shade of the cave's outer chamber, where the limestone overhang made a kind of porch 6 meters deep, and she walked to the back of the cave with a lantern, and she stood there for a long time in the cool darkness listening. The air was 55 degrees Fahrenheit. She had measured it with the thermometer Magnus had taught her how to read. Outside the prairie was 91. Inside the stone, it was as if she had walked into a different season. She closed her eyes. She put her hand on the wall. "You were right, Magnus," she said to no one. "You were right." The dog Björn, who had been pacing the entrance with the wary curiosity of his breed, came back and sat down against her skirts and pressed his ribs to her shin. Björn was 5 years old with the curled tail and the wolf-gray double coat and the dark, intelligent eyes of his line, and he had been Magnus's last gift to her, brought home as a half-grown puppy from a Norwegian breeder in Minneapolis, the Christmas before Magnus died. He had been her shadow ever since. He had walked at her heel through the funeral. He had slept across the foot of her cot in the boarding house for 2 years. He had ridden in the wagon between her boots all the way from Minneapolis to Hollowfield, his head on her lap, when she cried at night, his great paws warm against her knee. He was hers, and she was his, and neither one of them had been able to forgive the world yet for what it had taken away. She knelt down beside him in the cave and rubbed her thumb behind his ear. "We are going to be all right," she told him. "You and me and Copper and Astrid when she gets here. We are going to be all right." He licked her wrist once, and then leaned his great gray head against her shoulder and sighed. 6 days later, Astrid Halverson stepped down from the train at the Hollowfield depot with a carpetbag in one hand and a wooden tool chest in the other. Astrid was 24. She was Magnus's younger sister, and she had his same wide cheekbones, and his same pale gray eyes, and his same way of looking at a piece of wood as though it had been waiting for her to find it. Her father had been a master carpenter in a town outside Bergen, and he had taught her, as he had taught Magnus, that wood was not a dead thing. Wood was a slow animal. Wood remembered the tree it had been. Wood would settle and shift and breathe with the seasons, and the carpenter's job was not to dominate it, but to listen to it. Astrid had been engaged to be married 3 months before to a young man in Minneapolis named Henrik Lindstrom, whose father owned a dry goods store on Hennepin Avenue. The wedding had been planned for September. What Sigrid did not know yet, what Astrid would tell her only one evening in late September by the fire at the cabin door, was the exact word Henrik's mother had used at the dinner table the previous spring. The word was peasant. The word had been spoken about Magnus, who was dead, and about Magnus's grandfather, who had taught Magnus everything he knew about reading the land. Astrid had heard the word and had set down her fork, and in the silence between the soup and the meat, she had understood with a clarity she would carry for the rest of her life that to stay in that house, to marry into that family, would be to spend her entire life being polite about the people who had made her. She had stood up. She had walked out. She had walked through the Minneapolis dusk with her hands in fists in her coat pockets, and by the time she reached her boarding house, she had decided that the next train going west would carry her on it. She had written 2 letters that night. The first was to Henrik returning his ring. The second was to Sigrid saying, "I am coming. I will arrive on the 18th. That decision was the second piece of Sigrid's wall. Magnus had laid the first in pencil on the back of a survey map 3 years before he died. Astrid laid the second with her bare hands in the kitchen of a man who had called her family peasants. Sigrid met her at the depot in the wagon. The 2 women looked at each other for a long moment in the bright July sun, and then Astrid set down her tool chest and her carpetbag and walked into Sigrid's arms, and the 2 of them stood there in the dust for as long as it took, and neither of them said a word, because neither of them needed to. When they pulled back, Astrid wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand and gave a short, embarrassed laugh. "Well," she said, "show me this hole in the ground." By the time they had unloaded her trunk into the cave that evening, by the time Björn had circled Astrid 4 times, sniffing her boots, and finally pressed his nose into her palm in solemn approval, by the time the sun had set red and slow over the prairie and the first stars had come out above the bluff, the second piece of our story had quietly arrived. Sigrid had a sister now. Not a sister-in-law, a sister. And the work could begin. Word got around Hollowfield, as word does in a town of 412 souls, before the second week was out. By the end of July, every man in the saloon had an opinion about the cave widow, as she had already been named, and most of the opinions were the same opinion dressed in different hats. Thaddeus Beaumont, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county, and a $3,000 oak-framed barn that he was proud of, in the way that a small man is proud of a tall hat, rode out to the bluff on his silver-saddled stallion one Sunday afternoon to look at what he called in front of his ranch hands the burrow. He sat his horse at the edge of the cave's outer chamber and watched the 2 women working. Sigrid was in the back marking lines on the limestone floor with a piece of charcoal where the cabin's foundation piers would sit. Astrid was at a sawhorse, planing a ponderosa pine board with long, even strokes, her hair tied back with a strip of leather, the muscles in her forearms moving with the easy rhythm of a woman who had been taught to use her body for work before she had been taught to use it for anything else. Mrs. Halverson, Thaddeus Beaumont said. Sigrid looked up. She did not stand. Mr. Beaumont. I have a barn, he said. $3,000, 2 stories. Pegged oak, finest in the territory. You ever seen it? I have not. I am told you intend to live in a hole. I intend to live in a house, she said. The house happens to be inside a hole. There is a difference. He laughed. It was a short, hard laugh, the laugh of a man who had decided in advance that whatever the woman said was going to be funny. A widow, he said, digging like a badger. In 1883, in the United States of America. Astrid at her sawhorse did not look up. She kept planing. The board hissed under her blade. Sigrid said, You are welcome to ride back at Christmas, Mr. Beaumont, and tell me how your barn is doing. He looked at her for a long moment. He had expected perhaps to be argued with. He had not expected to be invited back. He touched the brim of his hat and rode away. That night in the Hollowfield saloon, he stood at the bar with one boot on the rail and told the assembled men what he had seen. He told them about the widow with the charcoal and the sister with the plane and the great gray dog that had watched him the whole time without blinking. He told them she had said she would live in a hole. He told them she had lost her senses with her husband. By the next morning, a betting pool had been opened. $2 to enter. The pot would go to the man who guessed within a week the date on which Sigrid Halverson would walk into Mayor Pritchard's office and ask to sell the parcel back. The earliest guess was September 15th. The latest was the 1st of February. His son, Otis Beaumont, who was 19 and home from college in St. Paul, put $20 on the 8th of December. He told everyone in the saloon loudly that the cave widow would not make it to Christmas. A new phrase entered the language of Hollowfield that summer. To pull a Halverson, the men said, was to do an elaborate, foolish, useless thing when a simple solution was sitting in front of you in plain sight. The phrase spread fast. It got into the schoolyard. It got into the church basement. Miss Prudence Whitaker, the school teacher who had a degree from a women's college in Ohio and considered herself a woman of progress, told her class one Wednesday in August that the Halverson women on the bluff represented regrettably a failure to embrace the forward march of civilization. We do not, she said in the year of our Lord, 1883, live in caves any longer. There is a reason. A small boy in the back row, Ezra Beaumont, who was Otis's younger brother and only 9 years old, raised his hand and asked, But Miss Whitaker, what is the reason? She did not have an answer ready. She moved on to long division. Reverend Ezekiel Marsh, the Methodist pastor, was less restrained. From the pulpit on the second Sunday in August, he preached for 40 minutes on the difference between the cave of the patriarchs, in which God's people had taken shelter in times of trial, and the cave of the pagan, in which the unbeliever had hidden from the light. He did not name Sigrid Halverson. He did not need to. Half the congregation turned and looked at her empty pew, the one she had stopped sitting in 3 weeks earlier when the whispers had become unbearable. Cyrus Holloway, the town's master builder, paid his own visit the following Wednesday. He was less arrogant than Beaumont, less doctrinaire than the Reverend, but in his way more devastating because he came as a professional. He walked the length of the foundation lines Sigrid had marked. He squatted down. He ran his thumb along the limestone where the first pier would sit. He stood up. He shook his head slowly. Mrs. Halverson, he said, with the genuine sadness of a man watching a child walk toward a stove. A house needs to settle. You set your piers on bedrock, and they will not settle. The frame will fight the stone, and the frame will lose. Your joints will crack within 2 winters. Your floor will warp. Your door will not close. The piers will not move. Sigrid said, because the stone will not move. The frame will not fight the stone. The frame will rest upon the stone the way a man rests in a chair. He looked at her. He looked at Astrid. He looked at the cave. "You are venting a stovepipe," he said, "through a fissure in the rock." "I am. That fissure will draw poorly. That fissure will smoke. That fissure will fill with creosote. And one night you will have a chimney fire in a cave full of cured pine, and you and your sister will not walk out. That fissure," Sigrid said, "is 12 inches across at its narrowest and 40 feet deep, and it opens at the top of the bluff into open air, with a vertical draft of 9 feet per second on a still day. I have measured it. My husband's anemometer is over there on the rock. You are welcome to verify." He did not verify. He took his hat off his head and held it in both hands, and looked at her with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite anger, but something more bewildered than either. "You are overthinking it," he said. "A square house on a flat piece of land. That is what works." He left. That night by the fire at the mouth of the cave, with Björn stretched out at her feet and Copper grazing in the dusk on the strip of grass below the bluff, Sigrid took out Magnus's journal and laid it open on her knee. She had not been brave enough in the first year of her widowhood to read it through. She had opened it twice and closed it both times because the handwriting was Magnus's, and the handwriting could undo her. But in the last month since she had arrived at the bluff, she had begun to study it page by page the way a student studies a text. She had been working her way through the survey notes and the cross-sections and the rough estimates of cubic feet of timber, and tonight she had reached a section in the back near the end that she had not seen before. The section was titled in Magnus's careful hand simply "Note on Cycle." She turned the page. It was a clipping from the Smithsonian dated 1879 glued onto the page. The clipping summarized a paper given at a meeting of the American Meteorological Society by a professor at Yale, in which the professor had compiled the journals of Jesuit missionaries, Hudson's Bay traders, and Lakota and Pawnee oral historians regarding extreme winters on the northern Great Plains over the previous 2 centuries. The professor had identified with what he called preliminary but suggestive certainty a recurring pattern. Every 80 to 90 years, the paper said the northern plains experienced a winter of catastrophic severity, characterized by sustained subarctic temperatures, multiple consecutive blizzards, and widespread livestock and human mortality. The last such winter on record had been the winter of 1803 to 1804, known in the Lakota tradition as the Winter of the Great White Death. Beneath the clipping in Magnus's pencil was a single line. "If the cycle holds, the next will fall between 1883 and 1894. Build for it." Sigrid sat very still by the fire. Björn, sensing the change in her, lifted his head from his paws and looked at her with his dark, intelligent eyes. She closed the journal. She put her hand on the dog's broad gray head. "Magnus," she whispered, "you did not just build me a house. You built me a fortress against a thing you knew was coming." She did not cry. She had used up the easy tears in the first year. What she did instead was something quieter. She rose and she walked to the back of the cave, and she put both hands flat against the cold limestone wall, and she stood there for a long time listening to the slow, deep silence of the rock, the silence of a thing that had been here for 40 million years and would be here for 40 million more. Outside, somewhere across the Canadian border, the first cold air of the coming season was already beginning to gather. Let me pause here for a moment. Have you ever found after someone you loved had died a letter or a note or an instruction they left behind without knowing they were leaving it? A recipe in their handwriting, a folded receipt in a coat pocket, a sentence underlined in a book on their shelf, something that felt when you held it like they had reached forward through time to put a hand on your shoulder. If you have, leave one word in the comments, just the object, the receipt, the recipe, the book. We will hold these small holy things together for a moment before we go on. By the middle of October, the cabin was finished. Let me tell you what they built, because the building is the heart of this story, and because 80 years later, a research team from North Carolina State University would measure what these 2 women did in 1883. and conclude that they had achieved with hand tools and instinct and an inherited tradition a structure that performed at roughly 2 4/10 times the thermal efficiency of a conventional frame house of the same volume. They built a cabin 6 meters wide and 9 meters deep, set 6 meters back from the cave's mouth on stone piers raised 60 centimeters above the cave floor. The piers were dry-laid limestone, each one bedded into a notch cut into the bedrock, so the cabin could not shift sideways even in an earthquake. The frame was post and beam-pegged ponderosa pine, every joint a mortise and tenon Astrid had cut by hand with the chisels her father had given her at her confirmation. There was no nail in the load-bearing structure of the house. A nail rusts. A peg properly cut from heart pine lasts 400 years. The walls were Magnus's design and Sigrid's adjustment. 2 layers of planed pine, an inner skin and an outer skin 14 inches apart. The cavity between them was packed with raw sheep's wool that they bought fleece by fleece from a sheep rancher named Olav Brekka, who lived 12 miles east and who was like them Norwegian, and who, unlike anyone else in the county, did not laugh when they told him what they were planning to do with the wool. He had said in his slow, careful English, "This is how my grandmother insulated her loft." He had charged them half the going rate. 14 inches of wool gave the walls a thermal resistance that in modern terms would later be measured at an R value of 35. A wall in a typical American frame house in 1883 had an R value of about 2.5. The roof was a single sloped surface running back into the cave sealed against the limestone ceiling with a thick caulk of pine pitch and beeswax. The floor was double-planked pine over an air gap of 8 inches, so the floor itself never touched the cold of the stone beneath. The door was solid white oak, 3 inches thick, banded with iron. Astrid had cold-forged with a hammer she had brought from Minneapolis in her trunk. There was one window set into the wall that faced the inner cave, so it looked not at the prairie, but at the lantern-lit anteroom where the animals would be stalled in winter. The window faced into shelter, not out of it. The stove was a small cast-iron potbelly Sigrid had ordered from a foundry in St. Paul for $22. Its flue pipe ran up 9 meters to a natural fissure in the cave's ceiling, a vertical crack that opened 40 feet above at the top of the bluff. Sigrid had climbed the exterior of the bluff 3 times in early September to cap that opening with a field stone chimney mortared with lime that drew like the throat of a hawk. To the side of the cabin, still inside the protection of the cave's outer chamber, they built 3 stalls. One for copper, one for the milk cow they bought from a German widow named Helga Vogel in late September for $11. One for the 2 nanny goats Sigrid had brought down on a wagon from Bismarck. Björn would sleep, she had decided, wherever he chose to sleep, and what he chose every night was a folded blanket on the floor at the foot of her bed. At the back of the cave, in a side passage where the limestone changed to a softer dolomite, they dug a root cellar 3 meters by 4 meters. The temperature there by November had settled to a constant 45 degrees Fahrenheit summer and winter. The total cost of the build, not counting their labor, came to $371.18. They had a little less than $300 left in the tin box. Enough if they were careful to get them through the winter and into the spring. The day they moved in, October 1st of 1883, was a clear, cold morning with a sky the color of a robin's egg and a wind out of the southwest that smelled very faintly of wood smoke and dry grass. Sigrid stood inside the finished cabin and turned in a slow circle and looked at what she and Astrid had made. "Magnus," she whispered. "We did it." Then she walked out to the mouth of the cave and she stood there beside her sister, and she watched the sun come up over the prairie, and for the first time in 2 years and 7 months, the weight in her chest shifted just a little and let her breathe. The path from here on begins to climb. The work is about to be tested. Walk with me. The autumn came on hard and beautiful. The cottonwoods along the creek south of the bluff turned the color of beaten gold, and then the color of fire, and then they let their leaves go in a slow, drifting fall that lasted 3 weeks. The first frost was on the morning of October 11th, The first snow, a light dusting that the prairie wind swept clear by noon, was on the 20th. Inside the cabin in the cave, the temperature held at 62 degrees Fahrenheit, without the stove lit at all. By the end of October, when night temperatures outside had dropped to 20 degrees, and the people in Hollowfield were burning through their first cord of firewood, Sigrid was lighting her potbelly stove for 1 hour in the morning, allowing the cabin to come up to a comfortable 68, and then letting it go out. The thermal mass of the limestone holding at a constant 55, and warmed gently by the small fire, and by the body heat of 2 women, a horse, a cow, 2 goats, and a dog did the rest. The cabin held its 68 degrees until late afternoon. A second fire in the evening for cooking kept them warm through the night. They were burning by Sigrid's careful count about 1/4 the wood that an average Hollowfield household was burning. Word of this got around too, although it got around more slowly than the laughter had. The first to notice quietly were the women of the town. The women who managed the wood piles and tracked the cost of fuel against the household budget were the ones who began in late October to ride out to the bluff with various pretexts. To buy butter from Sigrid, who had begun to churn small amounts of butter from the milk cow's surplus. To buy eggs, although Sigrid did not yet have chickens. To return a borrowed pot, although Sigrid had never lent them anything. What they were really doing, although none of them said it was looking, they were looking at how warm the cabin was. They were looking at the small contained fire in the stove. They were looking at the modest woodpile stacked neatly in the outer chamber, a woodpile that by the second week of November was still almost as full as it had been on October 1st. Old Margit Solheim was the first of the women to say anything about it directly. Margit was 71. She was a widow herself of 15 years standing, and she had come over from Norway as a girl of 9 in 1821. She lived alone in a small frame house at the south end of town, and she remembered, although she rarely spoke of it, the Yortis, the earth-banked, turf-roofed houses of the village she had been born in, houses that had stood since the time of her great-grandmother's great-grandmother and were still standing the last she had heard when she left. She came out to the bluff on a cold, blue afternoon in early November in a wagon driven by her grandson, and she walked into the cabin, and she stood in the middle of the floor, and she closed her eyes, and she breathed in deeply through her nose. Then she opened her eyes, and she looked at Sigrid, and she said in Norwegian, "My grandmother's house smelled like this." Sigrid said in Norwegian, "Mine too." Margit nodded once. She walked the length of the cabin, slowly running her hand along the planed pine walls. She stopped at the cabin's small inner window and looked out at the lantern-lit anteroom and the soft, slow movement of Copper in his stall. She turned back. "There will be a winter," she said. "I know," Sigrid said. "When it comes," Margit said, "my grandsons will come here. You will come here too," Sigrid said. "All of you. There is room." Margit nodded once more. Then very slowly, she reached out and took Sigrid's hand in both of her own thin, cold, papery hands, and she held it for a long moment without saying anything, and then she turned and walked out to the wagon. 3 days later, on the morning of November 9th, Joseph Standing Bear came up the bluff. He came on foot, although he was 68 years old. He came alone. He came carrying a small, dark, soft-tanned leather pouch on a thong around his neck and a walking staff of polished ash and nothing else. Sigrid had seen him twice in town and had nodded to him the way one nods to a respected stranger, and had not known until that morning that he had walked her husband's surveys with him in the summer of '79, and that he had taught Magnus how to read the wind off the bluff and how to tell by the angle of a flock of geese whether a storm was 3 days out or 1. He stopped at the mouth of the cave. He did not come in. "Mrs. Halverson," he said. "Mr. Standing Bear, your husband," he said, "was a good man. Thank you." He sat down on a flat stone at the mouth of the cave, and Sigrid sat down on another stone 3 feet from him, and Björn came and lay down between them, his great gray head on his paws, his eyes on the prairie. "I have come," Joseph Standing Bear said, "because of what is in the sky." "What is in the sky?" He did not answer at once. He looked out across the prairie at the brown grass and the low gray clouds and the long, slow shadow of the bluff falling east across the land. When I was a boy, he said, my grandmother told me a story. She had it from her grandmother, who had it from her grandmother. The story was about a winter that came when my great-great-grandmother was a young woman. The cold came down out of the north like a sheet of iron. The snow came sideways for 9 days. The buffalo died in the open. The horses froze standing. 40 people from our band took shelter in a cave on this bluff. 38 of them walked out alive when the snow stopped. The other 2 were old, and they had given their blankets to the children. He paused. That was a long time ago, he said. My grandmother was very old when she told me. She said the winter happens again, not every year, not every life, but it happens again. The land remembers. He turned his head and looked at Sigrid. This year, he said, the geese flew south 3 weeks early. The badgers have dug deeper than I have seen them dig in 50 years. The bark on the cottonwoods is thicker on the north side by ½ an inch. The sky 2 nights ago was the color of an old penny at sunset. He paused again. It comes, he said. I do not know when, but it comes. Sigrid was quiet for a long time. Then she said my husband knew it was coming. He left me a note. He read about a cycle in a paper from Yale. 80 to 90 years. The last one was 1804. Joseph Standing Bear nodded slowly. 1804, he said. That is when my great-great-grandmother walked out of this cave, with 37 other people, and 2 were dead. They sat in silence. Then the woman and the man and the dog and the wind moved over the grass below them with the soft, dry sound of something being slowly turned over. Before he left, Joseph Standing Bear stood up and took the small leather pouch from around his neck and held it out to her. This was your husband's, he said. He gave it to me when we parted in '79. He said, hold this for me until I come back. I did not know until last week that he was not coming back. I have brought it to his wife. Sigrid took the pouch in both hands. It was tobacco. Magnus's tobacco. She could smell it through the leather. She closed her hand around it and pressed it to her chest, and she did not trust herself to speak. Joseph Standing Bear touched the brim of his hat. When the snow comes, he said, I will come here. You will be welcome, she said. He walked back down the bluff. She watched him go until he was a small, dark shape against the brown grass, and then a smaller shape, and then nothing. What follows next is the hardest part of the story. It is going to ask something of you. It is going to ask you to sit for a little while with what it is like to know a thing that nobody else will believe. If you have ever known a true thing that no one would listen to, leave a word in the comments. Just one. The word truth. The word ignored. Whatever fits. We are going to keep going, the 2 of us. January came in cold and clear. The prairie went silver under a hard, dry, blue-white sky, and the cottonwoods along the creek stood black against the snow, and the wind off the bluff was sharp enough to cut a man's breath in half. The temperature on the morning of January 8th was 9 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The cabin in the cave was 66 degrees inside, with the stove unlit since the previous evening. On the morning of January 12th, Sigrid noticed that Björn would not eat. He stood by his bowl. He looked at it. He looked at her. He went to the cave mouth and stood there, his ears pricked forward, his nose lifted. She went and stood beside him. The sky to the north was the color of an old penny. 3 days, she said to no one, and to him. He whined softly low in his throat, and then he turned and walked back into the cabin and lay down across her boots. She took down Magnus's barometer from its hook on the cabin wall. She read it. She read it again. She tapped the glass. The needle had fallen in 24 hours by an amount she had never seen. She put on her coat. She put on her boots. She put on Magnus's beaver fur hat, which she had not worn until that morning. She saddled Copper. She told Astrid she was going to town. Astrid said, "What are you going to do?" Sigrid said, "I am going to try." She rode the 4 miles to Hollowfield with Magnus's journal in her saddlebag, open to the page with the Smithsonian clipping and the pencil note. She rode straight to the Hollowfield Mercantile, where she knew at that hour on a Saturday she would find Mayor Pritchard and Cyrus Holloway and Thaddeus Beaumont and Reverend Marsh all gathered around the wood stove in the back taking their coffee. She walked in. She set the journal on the counter open to the page. "Gentlemen," she said, "there is a storm coming, a storm such as none of you have ever seen. The barometer has dropped by an amount that means catastrophe. The signs are in the sky and in the animals and in the wind. My husband, who was a railroad surveyor of 15 years standing, identified a pattern in the historical record and warned me to be ready. I am asking you to be ready also. Bank your fires deeper. Bring your stock inside. Check your roofs. Stock your wells. The storm will arrive within 4 days. It will last at least a week. The wind chill will be lethal in minutes. Please, I am asking you, please." The 4 men looked at her. Cyrus Holloway picked up the journal politely. He read the clipping. He read the pencil note. He set the journal back down on the counter and folded his hands in his lap. Thaddeus Beaumont, standing just behind him, leaned in close enough to read the page over Holloway's shoulder. His eyes moved slowly across the Smithsonian clipping. His jaw tightened for one moment almost invisibly. Then he straightened, and his face returned to the easy contempt it had worn when she walked in. "Mrs. Halverson Cyrus Holloway said gently, 'This is a paper from 4 years ago, by a professor in Connecticut. It is a paper,' she said, 'by a professor who compiled 2 centuries of evidence. It is, the Reverend Marsh said, also a paper that quotes Indian oral tradition. It is, Thaddeus Beaumont said, with the small, thin smile of a man who had decided in the moment he straightened up from the journal exactly how he was going to play the next 10 minutes, the kind of thing a widow reads when she has nothing else to do at night.' Mayor Pritchard cleared his throat. 'Mrs. Halverson,' he said, 'it is January. It is cold. The barometer falls sometimes. We have had cold winters before. We will have cold winters again. I appreciate your coming in. I do. But I cannot in good conscience raise an alarm across this town based on, forgive me, a clipping and a feeling. The feeling,' she said, "is shared by Joseph Standing Bear." Thaddeus Beaumont laughed. "A Pawnee and a widow," he said. "That is who is going to tell us about the weather." She did not answer him. She picked up the journal. She closed it. She put it back in her saddlebag. She walked out of the Mercantile without another word. In the street, the cold hit her face. She mounted Copper and turned him toward the bluff, and as she did, a hand caught her stirrup. She looked down. Eliza Pritchard, the mayor's wife, stood in the dust beside her horse, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her eyes very large in her pale, tired face. "Mrs. Halverson," she said, "please. A moment." Sigrid dismounted. Eliza Pritchard pressed a small parcel into her hands. It was wrapped in a length of dark blue silk tied with a length of brown twine. It was the size of a small book. "This was my grandmother's," Eliza said. "She wrote it when she was a girl. She lived through the winter of 1804. She was 12 years old. She was one of the only people in her village who survived. I have read it. I have read it many times. I tried once to show it to my husband. He told me it was an old woman's nightmare. Please, take it, read it, and if the storm comes the way you say it will come, please. My boys, Carl and Albert. Carl is 6, Albert is 4. If the storm comes, please, open your door to my boys." Sigrid took the parcel. She put it into the inside pocket of her coat against her ribs, against her heart. "I will," she said. "I will open my door to your boys. I will open my door to you." Eliza Pritchard's face crumpled just for a moment, and then she straightened, and she squeezed Sigrid's hand hard, and she walked back into the Mercantile without looking back. Sigrid rode home through the cold. That night, by the lamplight in the cabin, with Björn pressed against her thigh and Astrid sitting across the table watching her face, Sigrid unwrapped the blue silk parcel and opened a small leather-bound journal written in a child's careful hand in faded ink dated 1804, signed Margaret Hollister, age 12. She read it aloud in pieces through the evening. The girl had lived in a village in Iowa. The storm had come on the 14th of February. It had lasted 11 days. Of the 63 people in the village, 41 had died. Margaret had survived because her family had a root cellar dug 8 feet into a hillside, and her father had moved them into the root cellar on the 3rd day, and they had stayed there, all 5 of them, and a dog, for 9 days, and they had come out into a world she did not recognize. The last entry in the journal said only those who lived under the ground walked out alive. Only those. Sigrid closed the journal. Astrid was crying quietly, her hands flat on the table. Sigrid said, "Astrid, listen to me. Tomorrow we ride out and bring back 20 more bales of hay from Olaf Brekke's barn. We fill every bucket we own with water. We move every cord of firewood from the outer chamber into the inner chamber. We pack the south-facing crack with extra wool. We seal the cabin door with strips of oiled canvas. We are going to be ready. Do you understand?" Astrid nodded. "And tomorrow night," Sigrid said, "you and I are going to sit by the fire, and we are going to drink coffee, and we are going to talk about anything we want to talk about, because we have done everything we can do, and after that, it is in God's hands, and Magnus's hands, and the hands of a Pawnee grandmother who has been dead 100 years. Astrid nodded again, and she reached across the table and she took her sister's hand, and the two of them sat there in the lamplight, while outside, far beyond the curve of the prairie, the wind began very softly to turn. The storm arrived on February 9th at 3:17 in the afternoon. We were there, you and I, in the first minute of this story. Now we come back to it, and we walk through it, and we do not look away. The temperature at 3 o'clock had been 5 degrees above zero. By 3:37, it was 17 degrees below. By 4 o'clock, it was 31 below. The wind, which at 3 o'clock had been a steady 15 miles per hour out of the southwest, was by 4 o'clock a sustained 60 out of the north-northwest, with gusts to 110. The snow did not fall. The snow was already on the ground. The snow attacked, lifted off the prairie by the wind, and driven horizontally, so that within the first 40 minutes, a man standing in the street in Hollowfield could not see his own hand if he held it at arm's length in front of his face. Inside the cabin in the cave, the temperature held at 67 degrees Fahrenheit. The stove ticked softly. Copper stood quiet in his stall. The cow chewed her cud. Björn lay flat on the cabin floor with his nose between his paws, and every 15 minutes or so he lifted his head and his ears swiveled forward, and he listened to something in the rock that no one else could hear. And then he laid his head back down and sighed. The storm did not end on the first night. The storm did not end on the second day. The storm did not end. In Hollowfield, in the dark of the second night, the great oak-framed barn of Thaddeus Beaumont, $3,000 of pegged pride, began to groan. The wind on the windward side had built a drift up its north wall to a height of 15 feet, then 20, then 25. On the morning of the third day, with a sound like a rifle shot, the central ridge beam cracked. The roof folded inward. 20 head of cattle were crushed where they stood. Beaumont in the main house listened to the destruction of his life's work over a period of 40 seconds, and could do nothing. In the parsonage, the Reverend Ezekiel Marsh's chimney, which Cyrus Holloway had built 10 years before, of fired red brick blocked with ice on the second day. The Reverend's stove began to smoke. By the third night, the parsonage was unlivable. The Reverend sat with his Bible in his lap and watched the temperature inside drop to 12 degrees, and he closed his eyes, and for the first time in his career, he did not know what to pray for. In the mayor's house, Bartholomew Pritchard was not at home. He had been at the Mercantile when the storm hit, and he had tried an hour into it to walk the 3 blocks home, and he had not arrived. He had become disoriented in the whiteout within 30 feet of the door. He had wandered in a circle for an unknown amount of time before he had collapsed against the side of a horse trough. He was found on the morning of the third day by a search party. He had lost both ears, all the fingers on his left hand, and 3 toes. He would live, but the man who had stamped the papers in July would not be the man who came out of the snow in February. Cyrus Holloway's roof in the heart of town was the strongest roof in Hollowfield. Cyrus Holloway had built it himself. On the second night, the wind found the eaves on the north side and lifted the entire roof off the house in one piece, like the lid off a box, and dropped it in the street. In a small frame house at the south end of town, Eliza Pritchard sat in the kitchen with her two small boys, Carl and Albert, and the temperature in the kitchen dropped hour by hour from 68 to 60 to 54 to 48. The chimney was drawing badly. The stove was eating wood at 3 times its normal rate. By the evening of the 4th day, they were down to their last quarter cord of wood, and Carl was crying without sound, and Albert had stopped crying entirely, which was worse. Eliza put on her coat. She put on her husband's coat over her own. She wrapped both boys in every blanket in the house. She picked Carl up in her arms. She told Albert to hold on to her belt and not let go for any reason. She opened the door and walked out into the storm. The bluff was 4 miles north. She knew in the way one knows a thing one has carried for many years that she would not make it. She knew also that there was no other place to go. She walked. At the bluff in the warm cabin, at exactly the moment Eliza Pritchard stepped out of her front door in Hollowfield, Björn lifted his head from the floor and barked once sharp and ran to the cabin door. Sigrid stood up. Björn. He scratched at the door. He whined. She opened it. He was through it in a flash, gone into the dark of the outer chamber, and she heard him at the cave mouth barking and barking the deep, certain bark of an elk hound on a track. Sigrid pulled on her coat. She pulled on her hat. She told Astrid, get the kettle on, get blankets, stoke the stove. There is someone coming. She lit a lantern. She walked out to the cave mouth behind the dog. The wind hit her like a wall. She could see by the lantern's small yellow circle perhaps 8 feet in any direction. Beyond that, white nothing. Björn was at the very edge of the cave's overhang, his coat dusted white, his great head pointed out into the storm. He barked. He waited. He barked again. She heard faintly beneath the howl of the wind a child crying. She moved out from under the overhang. She held the lantern as high as she could. She called, "Hello? Hello? This way. Follow the light. This way." The crying came closer. Then out of the white a small dark figure stumbled into the lantern's circle. A boy 4 years old, his small hand frozen white around the belt of a woman's coat. The woman dragged behind him. She was carrying another child. She fell to her knees 10 feet from the cave mouth. Sigrid was on her in an instant. She took the child Carl from Eliza's frozen arms. She pulled Eliza upright. She got them all inside. She slammed the door of the outer chamber. She got them into the cabin. Astrid had the stove blazing. She had blankets. She had a kettle on. She took Albert, the 4-year-old, and stripped his frozen mittens off and pressed his small white hands to her own bare belly under her shirt to warm them slowly. Sigrid did the same with Carl. Eliza Pritchard sat on the floor by the stove and shook and could not speak. In the hour that followed, Björn went to the cave mouth 6 more times and barked. By midnight, there were 9 people in the cabin. By the morning of the 5th day, there were 17. By the afternoon of the 6th, there were 23. By the evening of the 7th, there were 27. They came in 2s and 3s, frostbitten and silent and weeping, following the dog's bark and the lantern's small, fierce light. They came on foot. They came on a single horse with 3 children clinging to its mane. They came from town and they came from outlying farms. They came because there was nowhere else to go, and because someone in a paper from Yale 4 years before the snow began to fall had identified a cycle, and a man who had read about that cycle had drawn a plan, and a woman who had loved that man had built it brick by stone by board, while a whole town stood around her and laughed. Margit Solheim came on the 3rd night with 3 grandsons. Joseph Standing Bear came on the 4th, walking out of the storm with a hand on the bluff face to guide him, having walked 7 miles in conditions no living person should have survived. He sat down by the stove and accepted a cup of hot broth and did not say a word for 2 hours. The Reverend Ezekiel Marsh came on the 5th day with his wife and 4 children. He stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked at Sigrid, and his face, which had preached against her in August, twisted, and he said, "Mrs. Halverson, I was wrong," and Sigrid said, "Come in, Reverend, there is soup." Miss Prudence Whitaker came on the 5th evening, leading 3 of her students by the hand. The other 6 children in her classroom had not been able to leave their homes. She had walked the 3 miles from the schoolhouse with all the strength of a woman who had lectured the previous August on the failure of cave-dwelling to embrace civilization. She did not look at Sigrid when she came in. She could not. She sat down by the stove and put her arms around the 3 small children and rocked them quietly for an hour without speaking. The next morning, when Sigrid brought her a cup of coffee, Miss Whitaker took it with both hands and said in a voice almost too soft to hear, "The children are alive because of you. The children are alive because of you. The children are alive because of you." She said it 3 times. She could not seem to stop saying it. Cyrus Holloway came on the 5th night with his wife. 2 fingers on his right hand were black. The doctor was not there. Sigrid cleaned them as best she could and bound them with strips of clean cotton and gave him a tin cup of whiskey and put him by the fire. He did not look at her. He could not. Otis Beaumont came on the 6th morning with 4 of his father's ranch hands. He had walked out of the ranch house with them after the barn went down because the main house, badly damaged in the second night's wind, was no longer safe. The other 2 ranch hands had not made it. Otis was 19 years old, and his face had not been touched by the cold, but his hands shook and would not stop shaking. He sat down in a corner of the outer chamber and did not speak for 2 days. Thaddeus Beaumont was the last to come. He came alone on foot on the evening of the 6th day. He had lost his wife Cordelia on the 3rd night when she had tried to walk to the hen house to bring the chickens inside and had not come back. He had spent the next 3 days unable to leave the body, which lay where it had fallen in the yard. He had come in the end because his son Otis had not come back, and he had walked 4 miles in the storm to find out if his son was dead too. Sigrid opened the door to him. He stood in the doorway, snow caked in his beard, his eyes the eyes of a man who had been broken not by the storm, but by himself, and he opened his mouth to say something, and nothing came out. Sigrid said, "Your son is alive. He is by the fire." Thaddeus Beaumont put his hands over his face. Sigrid took his arm and brought him inside. That night, the 6th night of the storm, with 27 people sleeping wherever there was room to lie down, Sigrid sat by the stove with a tin cup of coffee and listened to the slow, steady breathing of the room, and she thought, "We are going to make it. All of us. We are going to make it." Then, in the dark of the cave, behind her, far back in the side passage, where the root cellar lay, Björn began to bark. He had been quiet for 2 days. He had been quiet because the work of barking the lost into the cave was finished, and he was a dog who knew when his work was finished. Now he was not quiet. Now he was running back into the dark of the cave, away from the people, away from the fire, into a place where no one had any reason to go. Sigrid stood up. She took a lantern. She followed him. He was at the far back of the cave at the entrance to the side passage. His hackles up his nose pointed at the ceiling, and he was barking and barking, the deep, terrified, certain bark of a dog who knew a thing that the humans had not yet noticed. Sigrid raised the lantern. She listened. For a long moment she heard only the dog and the slow, far hush of the storm outside. Then she heard very faintly a sound that was not the wind, a sound that was inside the rock, a sound like a long, slow tearing of paper. She knew with absolute certainty what it was. She turned. She ran. She ran back through the cave to the cabin, and she pulled open the cabin door, and she said in a voice that did not shake, but that everyone in the room would later remember, "Everyone. Up. Now. into the outer chamber. Move, move, move. They moved. 27 people, sleeping or half-sleeping, stumbled out of the cabin and into the outer chamber, the part of the cave nearest the cabin and farthest from the side passage. Mothers carried children. Otis Beaumont half-carried his father. The Reverend Marsh carried Margaret Solheim. Joseph Standing Bear, the last to move because he was always the last to move, walked out backwards with his hand on the cabin wall, his eyes on the dark. They got out. 2 hours later, at 3 in the morning of the 7th day, a section of the cave ceiling above the side passage gave way under the pressure of ice expansion in a fault that ran the length of the bluff, and a section of limestone 4 meters by 6 meters fell into the side passage and onto the root cellar in a single concussive crash that they felt through their bones. No one was hurt. No one was even bruised. In the dark, in the silence after the fall, with the dust still settling, Sigrid sat down on the cold stone floor of the outer chamber with Björn pressed against her side, and she put her arms around the dog's broad gray neck, and she pressed her face into his fur, and she wept for the first time in 2 years and 7 months. Pause here with me for a moment. I want you to think about the dog. About a Norwegian elk hound named Björn, 5 years old when this story began, who had walked through a funeral and slept across the foot of a widow's bed for 2 years and ridden a wagon across half a continent with his head on his mistress's lap. A dog who on a night in February of 1884 heard a sound inside a wall of limestone that no human ear in the world could have heard, and who barked and barked and barked until the woman who loved him got up and listened. If you have ever in your life been saved by an animal, leave the word "saved" in the comments. Just that word. Björn would have liked to know. We are almost home now. One more night, one more dawn. The storm broke on the morning of the 8th day. It broke as suddenly as it had come. At 7 o'clock on the morning of February 16th, the wind dropped. By 8, the sky to the west was a pale, cold blue. By 9, the sun was up, and Sigrid Halvorsen stood at the mouth of the cave with 27 people gathered behind her, and they looked out at a world none of them recognized. The prairie was buried. Hollowfield was a series of small white mounds. Drifts ran 15 and 20 feet deep. The cottonwoods along the creek were broken. There was no sound. There were no birds. The land had been emptied. In the days that followed, the search parties went out. Sigrid organized them. She gave them broth and dried meat and lent them shovels and sent them down off the bluff in groups of 3. They brought back the living, and they brought back the dead. And they laid the dead in a row in the outer chamber of the cave, where the cold preserved them until the ground could be opened in April. 12 people had died in Hollowfield and the surrounding farms. Cordelia Beaumont, 2 of Beaumont's ranch hands, a widower named Hubert Knox, who had lived alone in a sod house south of town. The Knox brothers who had tried to ride to him on the 2nd day. A young mother and her infant in a homestead 5 miles east. 3 children of a family named Larson, who had been trapped in a collapsed barn with no fire. A traveling salesman caught between towns. 12. 27 in the cave had lived. A week later, when the road into town was passable, Thaddeus Beaumont walked the 4 miles back to Hollowfield on his own legs alone, except for Sigrid, who walked with him because he had asked her to. They walked in silence for the first 3 miles. At the edge of town, where the wreckage of the great oak-framed barn lay scattered across the field, he stopped. "Mrs. Halvorsen," he said. His voice was steady but very quiet. "I have a confession to make." She waited. "I read your husband's clipping," he said. "That morning in the mercantile, when you laid the journal on the counter. I leaned over Holloway's shoulder and I read it. I read the whole page. I read the pencil note. I knew you were right." She did not speak. "I did not say so," he said. "Because if I had said so in front of Pritchard and Holloway and Marsh, I would have been a man taking the word of a widow against the word of the town. I would have lost something. I do not know what I would have lost. I do not know what was so precious to me that I traded my wife's life for it. But I traded it. I traded her life for it. He stood there in the snow with his hat in his hands. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not deserve to ask, and he knew it. And that was a kind of mercy. Sigrid looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Mr. Beaumont, your son is alive. Your son needs you. You are going to spend the rest of your life being the father he needs. That is what you are going to do with your life. Do you understand me?" He nodded. He could not speak. They walked into town. In the spring, the town buried its dead. In the summer, the town began to rebuild. And in the rebuilding, something quiet and large happened. Cyrus Holloway, who had lost 2 fingers and his certainty in the same week, came to the cave one morning in May with a small leather notebook and a pencil. He stood at the foot of the bluff for a long time, and then he climbed up and he knocked on the door of the cabin, and when Sigrid opened it, he removed his hat and he said, "Mrs. Halverson, I have come to learn." She taught him. She taught all of them in time. Through the summer of 1884 and into the autumn, 11 new homes went up across Stark County, built on principles drawn from Magnus's journal and from Margit Solheim's memory of her grandmother's village, and from the way the Pawnee had banked their winter lodges against the wind for 10,000 years. Some were caves like Sigrid's, some were dugouts cut into south-facing hillsides, some were frame houses banked with earth on 3 sides to the eaves. All of them used the principle of thermal mass. All of them stood the next winter against weather that would have broken them 5 years before and held warm with a quarter of the wood. The town stopped saying pulled a Halverson. The town started saying built like the Halverson place. I want to ask you one last thing before we come to the end. If you could go back just once to the moment in your own life when you stood up and walked out of a room because someone said the wrong word about the people who made you, I want you to tell me in the comments what room it was. The dinner table, the office, the classroom, the church basement. Astrid walked out of one of those rooms in Minneapolis in the spring of 1883, and the walking out is what put her on the train, and the train is what brought her to the bluff, and the bluff is what saved 27 lives. The walking out matters. Tell me yours. In 1886, Sigrid published Magnus's journal as a book with her own notes and Astrid's drawings under the title Living with the Earth. The book sold modestly at first mostly to settlers and ranchers in the northern plains. By 1890, it had gone through 4 printings. In 1889, the University of Minnesota invited Sigrid to give a series of lectures in the Department of Agricultural Engineering. She accepted. She was the first woman to lecture in that department. She taught there every spring for 18 years. Astrid married in 1891 a Swedish carpenter named Sven Lundberg, who had come to Hollowfield to learn the building methods from her. They had 3 children. The youngest, a girl, was named Margit, after the old woman who had sat at Sigrid's kitchen table in November of 1883 and said my grandmother's house smelled like this. Mayor Bartholomew Pritchard never returned to office. The frostbite that had taken his ears and his fingers and his 3 toes took also in time his will to lead. He resigned in March of 1884. He lived 11 more years mostly silent, mostly alone, and was buried in the Hollowfield Cemetery in 1895. His grave on the day I am telling you this is not visited by anyone. Eliza Pritchard left her husband in the spring of 1885 and moved with her 2 boys to a small house at the foot of the bluff. She did laundry for the people in the cave settlement and lived a long, quiet, peaceful life. Carl, who had been 6 in the storm, grew up to be a doctor. Albert, who had been 4, grew up to be a writer of books about the West, and the first book he wrote in 1909 was a memoir titled Following the Light, about a dog at the mouth of a cave on a winter night. Otis Beaumont returned to college that autumn and took up the study of meteorology. He became in 1906 the first director of the United States Weather Bureau station at Bismarck. His younger brother Ezra, who had been 9 years old when Miss Whittaker had told her classroom that civilization meant leaving caves behind, grew up to become an architect. In 1928, the year Sigrid Halvorsen died, Ezra Beaumont designed and built the first earth-sheltered public school in the state of South Dakota on the prairie south of Hollowfield. He named it the Halvorsen School. It is still in operation. It still uses in its winter months approximately 1/4 the heating fuel of any comparable building in the county. Thaddeus Beaumont lived 19 more years. He never remarried. He sold the cattle operation in 1886 and used the money to build on the foundation of his collapsed barn a small white frame house in which he raised Ezra alone after Cordelia's death. He visited the cave once a year on the anniversary of the storm, and he sat with Sigrid on a bench at the cave mouth and did not say much, and he left a small wooden carving on the limestone shelf inside the door every year until the year he died. There are 19 carvings on that shelf. They are still there. Miss Prudence Whitaker resigned her teaching post in May of 1884 and spent the next 4 years studying nursing at a hospital in St. Paul. She returned to Hollowfield in 1888 and opened with funds raised by the women of the town a small clinic on Main Street. She ran it for 31 years. The first room of that clinic, the room she saw patients in, had no windows to the prairie. It had one window, and that window faced the inner courtyard. She had built it, she once told a young nurse, the way Sigrid Halvorsen had built her window. The Reverend Ezekiel Marsh preached every February 9th for the rest of his life on the same text. It was from the book of Hebrews. By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he went out not knowing whither he went. He never preached on the cave of the pagan again. Joseph Standing Bear lived to be 86. He spent the last 20 years of his life on the bluff in a small lodge he built 50 yards from the cave entrance, and he and Sigrid would sit out together on summer evenings and watch the sun set over the prairie and not speak because they did not need to. Björn the dog lived 11 more years. He died in his sleep in the spring of 1894, on his folded blanket at the foot of Sigrid's bed at the age of 16, which is a great age for a Norwegian elk hound. Sigrid buried him at the mouth of the cave in a small grave lined with limestone, and Astrid carved the headstone. The inscription in English and in Norwegian said, "He heard what humans could not." Copper the horse lived 7 more years, and was buried beside the dog in 1901. Sigrid Halvorsen lived until December of 1928. She was 78. She died in the cabin she had built in the cave Magnus had drawn in the bed she had slept in for 45 years, surrounded by Astrid and Astrid's children and Astrid's grandchildren on a clear, cold winter morning with the sun coming up gold over the prairie. Her last word in Norwegian was Magnus. She was buried on the bluff above the cave beside Joseph Standing Bear, who had been buried there in 1902. Astrid lived until 1939. She was 79. In 1952, the South Dakota Historical Society set a bronze plaque into the limestone wall at the entrance to the cave just to the right of the dog's grave. It is still there. The inscription reads, "The Halvorsen Shelter. Mocked as a widow's madness, proven as a husband's last gift, and a 1,000-year tradition's triumph." February 1884. When American civilization froze, Norwegian wisdom endured. 27 souls walked out alive. Here, Sigrid Halvorsen proved that love builds shelters across oceans and generations. In 1978, a team of researchers from North Carolina State University spent a summer at the cave taking thermal measurements. They concluded that the cabin in its original configuration achieved energy performance approximately 2 4/10 times that of a conventional wood frame house of equivalent volume. Their report was published in a journal of architectural engineering and is cited to this day in the literature on passive solar and earth-sheltered design. In 2003, when the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station was rebuilt to withstand the most extreme cold conditions on Earth, the design team consulted, among other historical precedents, the thermal mass principles documented in Sigrid Halvorsen's 1886 volume. The modern earthship homes that you can see today in New Mexico and Colorado and Montana, and the passive houses that are being built right now in the United States and in Germany and in the Scandinavian countries, from which Sigrid's grandmother-in-law came, all of them descend in a quiet and unbroken line from the principles a Norwegian widow and her sister-in-law built into a cave on a bluff in North Dakota in the autumn of 1883. The cave is still there. The cabin is still there. The temperature inside the cabin on the day I am telling you this story is the same 55 degrees Fahrenheit that it was on the morning Sigrid Halvorsen first walked into the dark with a lantern and put her hand on the wall. The wind on certain winter afternoons still finds the limestone hollows of the bluff and makes that sound the children used to call whispering. If you listen on those afternoons with the right kind of attention, you can almost hear what the bluff is saying. It is saying, "The wise do not fight the land. The wise listen to it. The wise build with it." It is saying, love does not end when a man dies. Love is what a man leaves behind drawn in pencil on the back of a survey map for the woman he did not yet have time to tell. It is saying the truest thing you will ever know is the thing that no one wants to hear, and you must say it anyway, and when the storm comes, you must open your door. I want to thank you for staying with me to the end of this story. I know it was a long one. I know it asked you to sit with grief and with cold and with the slow, hard, patient work of being right when the world is wrong. If you carried someone with you through this story, the way I asked you to, at the start, I hope they were warm in your hands the whole way. Before you go, tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me about a time when you knew a truth that no one would listen to and you said it anyway, and the years proved you right. Tell me about a husband or a wife or a parent or a friend whose plans you finished after they were gone. Tell me about a dog who once in your life knew something before you did. I will read everyone. We will all read everyone. And if you have learned something today, if you have felt something today, if you have been reminded today that the small, patient, mocked, derided, lonely work of a woman in a long black dress on a bluff in 1883 can still 142 years later reach across time and put a hand on your shoulder, then please subscribe to this channel and ring the bell so that the next time we sit down together, I can find you again. May your house be warm. May your door be open. May the wind, when it comes, find you ready. Good night.